Hello, my name is Jorb. I love gear. In anything involving money, there's a phrase. I'm sure you've heard it 1,000 times. You're probably numb to it at this point. This idea that the more money you pay for something, it will be better. I wanted to decide for myself if I felt like that held true in synthesizers. And in order to do that, I needed to limit my scope to things that had shared features. There's no value in comparing $1,000 of polysynths to $1,000 of monosynths to $1,000 of FM synths. They do different things. What I narrowed it down to was modern 2-oscillator monosynths. And you have 3 examples in front of us right here. The Base Station 2, available used between normally $300 and $400. The Dave Smith Instruments Mopho keyboard, somewhere between $400, $550, maybe $600. And on top, the Moog Sub37. This is the Tribute Edition. There's also a subsequent 37, but the prices for this anywhere between $950, $1,100, or $1,200. So in a few different categories, I'm going to talk about my experience and impression with all 3 of these synthesizers, how I feel they compare to each other. I won't be giving anybody a number ranking or a grade. I'll tell you which I like best or which performs the best in a few different categories. Those will be the core sound of the oscillators and filters, the options and flexibility available in sequencers, the build quality of the unit as a whole, including the way its keybed feels, their modulation options and flexibility, what can be routed to where, how wide are my options. Paired with that, in a way, is ease of use. How hard is it for me to get to these deep features? What do I have to do as a user to program these synths in the most complicated way they can be programmed? And then in the end, I'll do sort of end thoughts and what makes each one unique. So I hope that sounds like it'll be of interest to you. If you are subscribed, thank you. I think we're right around 1,500. I cannot believe it. It feels incredible. This is really accelerating. If you are not subscribed, which most of you are not, it's likely that you found this by searching. If you found it by searching and you made it this far in the video, you've proven to yourself that I and this content have value to you. And if you do subscribe, you'll learn ideas, gear, techniques that you might not have learned otherwise. You might not have even known you wanted to learn. There's my stupid pitch. Let's talk about gear. First and foremost, with the core sounds, the Sub37 has continuous waveforms. You blend comfortably between triangle, saw, square, and its pulse widths. On the Mopho, you have saw, triangle, saw plus triangle, and variable pulse width. You might notice on the Mopho there's a little fuzziness or an inaccuracy, and really low pulse widths sort of fizzles. I did some research, and there's some examples online that may be a manufacturing flaw. In most use cases, it is not audible. It seems really dramatic when you have no filter and you're just running the oscillator, and I run it all the way up to 99 pulse width. But in practice, I don't consider that to be a huge flaw. On the base station, you have sine wave, which you don't have on the other 2, triangle, saw, and square. These all have sub-oscillators. I don't cover them. You can decouple the pitch on the bass station, but you're locked to 1 or 2 octaves down on the Mopho and 1 octave down on the Sub37. In a lot of ways, I don't think it's reasonable to choose one I like the best. If you really, really need continuous waveforms, you have that on the Sub37. You don't on the other two. So if that's the end of it, that's the end of it. But other than that, I don't think the variance in the oscillator and filter sounds of any of these is enough for that to be your whole decision. They all sound very good. They're all very capable. All the arpeggiators essentially can do the same features, so I won't be discussing them, but the sequencers are very different. On the bass station, you get 32 steps that you input by plugging notes in on the keyboard. Could not be simpler to use. Plug in your notes, let it go. You have different rhythms for notes that are on and off. Immediately get really more interesting patterns of the same notes you plugged in. Wonderful. Couldn't be easier. I think it goes up to 32 steps. There's 4 sequences you can click through right here on the panel, which it's unfortunate they aren't tied to patches. So if you plug in one sequence on slot 1, no matter what patch you change to, that's the same sequence on slot 1. That isn't a negative, it's a difference. So say you have sequence 1 for the end of a song, but you want to change your patch but keep that sequence going as you blend into the other one. Well, you can change your patch but leave your sequence rolling. Just a difference, not a downside. On the Mopho, the sequencer isn't explicitly for notes. It can be modulation to anywhere, including the pitch of your oscillators. You have 4 lanes of maximum 16 steps. You don't have to have 4 that are 16. You can have 16, 15, 2, 3. It doesn't matter. They can be slewed to work like complex LFOs, and they can be routed essentially anywhere. There's our sound. Here's our sequence clicked on. And I'll do that as long as we hold a key. We can hold it, not just by pushing the push-it switch, but by scrolling in our miscellaneous parameters to making it toggle. And that won't just be the note we're holding. You have to separately assign the note you want it to be pushing. So let's set it to C4. And then once it's going, latched on with the push-it switch, you can't change anything. And the way you change notes, click in the sequencer here. In our first sequence row, you have 4. They're really modulation sequences. They don't have to be notes, but they can be. But when they're notes, it could be oscillator 1, 2, or all. And then you set individual steps by scrolling through and moving up. Really not a fun way to interact with the sequencer. This is separately, but also if you have latch on in the arpeggiator, it doesn't relatch. It adds those notes to mind-boggling decisions. On the Sub37, you have a maximum of 64 steps. It is tied to a patch. You plug notes in the same way that you do on the bass station, 1 key press at a time, rests or ties in between. There's a mode to edit individual steps down here on these 16 buttons. Okay, the sequencer on the Sub37 is not unlike the bass station. Back, play. There's even a mode where you can see the steps on these lights down here. See that? Super cool. Okay. And they can be edited specifically. Turned on and off specifically. You can turn them off. And turn them back on. And change parameters per. And it'll transpose with your key press. I gotta say, man, excellent. I love it's so easy to use the sequencer once you learn a few of the hotkeys. Once you know you can do bank and latch to see the step mode, and once you're in the step mode, the hotkeys that let you change certain things about those steps is very, very important. From best to worst for the sequencers, I think it's hard to argue with Sub37, Base Station, and then the Mopho. I don't think the Mopho is bad, but it's not easy to use, and manipulating it after you've set it in place is complicated. Sub37 is easy to input, easy to manipulate. Base Station, same thing, easy to input, easy to manipulate. Moving quickly on to build quality, because I don't think there's that much to say. The Base Station is all plastic. The pitch and mod wheel feel okay, but not exceptional. The keyboard is synth action, so to speak. It doesn't feel heavy. It springs back kind of softly, I suppose I'll say. I don't consider that to be a huge problem, especially on a monosynth. That's the action I am used to and like to play. On monophonic synths, the knobs will wiggle barely if you really try to do it. You would not notice unless you were looking for it. Moving on to the Mopho, it looks like cheddar cheese, huge plus. An all-metal body with wood sides. It's a little classier. The knobs barely wiggle if you try. The encoders wiggle a little more. The encoders feel kind of cheap to me, but that's just because I probably associate that with cheap gear that doesn't have real potentiometers. I consider the keybed to be too nice on the Mopho, and what I mean by that is feels kind of like semi-weighted Nord keys to me, where I don't expect to be playing monophonic synth parts on it. I expect to be playing polyphonic piano type patches. It's a little off-putting at first. I do not consider that to be a negative. It seems like an upmarket option where I wouldn't necessarily consider it needing one. And the pitch and mod wheel feel excellent on the Mopho. On top, the Sub37. Come on, you know what I'm going to say. All metal body. The knobs feel incredible. I honestly feel like I could lift it up by especially the filter knob. Look at that honker. It's big and heavy. It's got wood sides. The keyboard feels great. I consider it to be somewhere between these two. This might be a conversation I'm not qualified to have. I don't feel the same weighted springiness on this keyboard that I do on the Mopho. Again, I would not make your decision based on that. Just that these keys feel great and they're very sturdy. Pitch and mod wheel feel exceptional. The travel of the knobs is perfect. The detents in the middle of the knobs that are bipolar slides right in, not a problem. And so, unsurprisingly, build quality is where you really do get what you pay for. The most expensive one feels the best. I don't mean for this to be a greater discussion, but in some ways, of course, the one that's the most expensive, they had the most of their budget go to things like designing the body and picking out materials. Do with that what you will. This category is one of the most important to me, the modulation options or the flexibility in sound design. We're going to go from bottom to top. On the Base Station, you have 2 envelopes, 2 LFOs, and where they go is somewhat limited based on the panel and the function hotkeys. I don't consider it to be lacking, just not very flexible. LFO1 will always be pitch. LFO2 will always be pulse width in the filter. Moving on, the Mopho keyboard has almost more options for modulation than I think most people would ever even need. You have 3 envelopes, amp, filter, and auxiliary, which is wonderful. You have 4 LFOs. You have 4 sequencer lanes, which you consider to be complex LFOs. And then we have 4 rows of, we'll call it a modulation matrix, source, destination, and an amount. And then miscellaneous controllers. Miscellaneous modulation can be things like the mod wheel pointed to any one of a number of destinations. Velocity pointed to any one of a number of destinations. In effect, you have upwards of 16 rows of a modulation matrix with essentially no restrictions as to where things can get plugged. Incredible, and that's what originally attracted me to the Mopho. I like having options like that. I'm used to things like the DeepMind, which have complex modulation matrices, and that's how I am used to programming sounds anymore. Up to the Sub37, the modulation is kind of a big point of contention for me, and I know certain people will not agree, but you have 2 modulation buses, and you're restricted to 2 sources to multiple destinations, okay? So if you think of a traditional modulation matrix, source, amount, and destination, you can only have 2 sources at a time ever, and a maximum of 6 destinations. So if you're using 2 LFOs, you cannot route your velocity, aftertouch, or mod wheel to a place of your choosing. There are hardwired options for attenuating what's already in this mod bus with your mod wheel, your velocity, and your aftertouch. But if you want, for example, your mod wheel just to open up your filter, right? As you move up on the mod wheel, the filter gets wide open. Your source will be constantly on. And with that, you lose access to that first LFO. And so suddenly we have a 1 LFO synth, and we can't do anything else with this modulation bus unless I also want it to do pitch, which if I'm using the mod wheel, I probably won't. Or I want to assign it to any other mod controller. It has to be tied to the same value. What would work better for me is the LFOs have their destination on their own, and you have 2 mod buses. I'm sure this was a design compromise. It does not work well for me. There's too much I want to do with my other controllers to give them up in lieu of the LFOs. It's not a lack of options. It's just that they're always connected. Your pitch and your programmed destination, or your filter and your programmed destination, will be modulated by the same LFO, or the same sample and hold, or the same velocity, or what have you. To me, that ends up in less expressive patches. Another good example, just on the panel of the base station, you can have the pitch of your oscillator affected by your filter envelope. To do that, you're giving up one of your LFOs on the Sub37. With things like that in mind, my final order here, for your options of modulation, your options for sound design, Mopho, then the base station, then the Sub37. If you disagree on the mod buses, I want to hear why. If you do agree, I'd like to hear that as well. Alrighty, and down to ease of use. On each of these keyboards, how hard is it to get to the most complicated sound design options? Starting with the base station, almost nothing is hidden beyond a single layer, and that single layer is holding function and pressing a key. Everything you need is either on a knob on the panel or written directly on it. The only exceptions I can think of that aren't on the panel are everything added in the AFX mode, or decoupling the pitch of the sub-oscillator, which are all updates that happen later. And are written on the panel of the AFX station, just not this one. Got a little off track, but to summarize, nothing's more than a single layer deep, and that single layer is holding function and pressing something else. Base station is extraordinarily easy to use. The Mopho is hard enough to program that I would consider to be very frustrating. Changing any modulation takes a long time. To click through the LFO, the sequencer and modulators, miscellaneous mod, or up here into the miscellaneous parameters section, knowing where it's at, getting through there, clicking in your source, destination, and amount, especially with these very precise, finicky encoders, is not fast, is not intuitive. How it really manifests when you're using the Mopho, everything is slower. Everything you want to do takes a little more time, a few more steps. Definitely a downside. Onto the Sub37, it has far and away the most immediate control. You don't need to click a switch or a button to swap between your oscillators or your envelopes. They have their own sets of discrete controls. Wonderfully fast. Even modulation routings are available here on the panel. At most, some menu diving to set your program source and destination. Other than that, even clicking through patches and banks, because of these 16 dedicated knobs, is way faster on the Sub37. So, unsurprisingly, Sub37 wins. So again, in order, for ease of use, Sub37, the base station, and then the Mopho. So to give sort of summary thoughts on all three, if some element of the Sub37 pushed you over the edge and said, that's what I need to have that, go for it. If something about the other two seems perfect for you, go for it. These 3 synths can do the same jobs. They can run a sequence. They can be your bass line. They can be your lead line. Only in really specific cases are they going to feel that different. And the most dramatic difference is the user experience. And it's hard to sit down and decide if that user experience is worth the price difference to you. If the user experience of having all knobs straight out on the panel on a bigger, heavier unit is essential to you, is it $800 essential to you? Is it $1,200 versus $400? When I say user experience, I mean sitting down to play this, sitting down to design patches on this with any of these. And that's where the differences really are. It's different to program on all 3 of these. It's different to play on all 3 of these. It's different to change patches, for example, on all 3 of these. If you see $800 worth of a value in the user experience of the Sub37, then you can justify it. If you don't, then think about the base station. Or, all this said and done, if you get a relatively good deal on any of them, don't feel bad about buying them and selling it later if it doesn't work for you and trying something else and moving on. So, I could go on forever just chattering. If there's any component of these things I missed, or the most important part to you, or why you love one of the others, throw it in the comments. I'd love to talk about it. Or any other modern 2-oscillator monosynths you want to talk about. I just never have come across a monologue that was cheap enough for me to want to buy it. I wanted to include it because it's even cheaper and I wanted to try it, but I felt like 3 was a good number and the range of these was pretty good. And I don't think most people know much about the Mopho and blah, blah, blah. I hope what I talked about will give you even ideas for what to consider or parts of the user experience that do or don't matter to you. If I only had any of these 3, I wouldn't feel like I was missing out on anything. There's nothing save for the way distortion works on the Sub37 or the base station that I feel like I would miss, and I don't consider them to be essential. That's all I want to say. My name's Jorb. I love gear. I love mono synths. I appreciate you watching. I'll see you in the next one. Bye.